Welcome to the Digital Manufacturer Podcast, your frontline source for all things digital transformation in manufacturing. I'm your host, Mark Flynn, and I'm here to guide you through the evolving landscape of manufacturing. In each episode, we'll uncover the stories of innovation that are defining the industry, offering insights and strategies that help to drive growth and efficiency. Join us as we speak to thought leaders and visionaries who share their journeys and the lessons they've learned along the way. So let's dive into today's episode and discover what the future holds for the digital manufacturer. Hello everyone, very lucky to be joined by our guest today, Kevin O'Flynn, no relation, Sales Director at Replan, who are an industry leader in supply chain optimization and digital transformation. Kevin himself has a rich background in helping manufacturers to navigate complex supply chains, minimize disruption, and reduce costs using cutting-edge automated planning solutions. So I'm very excited to have this conversation with Kevin today. Kevin, you're very welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Thank you, Mark. Delighted to be on the show and to be talking to your audience.
That's brilliant. I appreciate your time. I wanted to dive right in because Replan is one of those tools that I look at with envy, and envy from a perspective of I wish I had that idea first, because it's a really intuitive, interesting, and one of those technologies that brings real value to customers very early on. So you might introduce the tool in the company and explain a little bit about the challenges you solve for your customer base.
Sure. No, you're very kind on the intro. So Replan is an advanced facility planning and scheduling solution. We help typically mid-sized manufacturers and large manufacturers as well to improve how they're doing their production planning and scheduling within the four walls of a factory. So given a demand forecast and orders, how do I best sequence those in my factory to maximize my operational KPIs? So that might be throughput, it might be service levels, it might be on time and full metrics, while hitting things like your inventory targets as well. For simple manufacturers, they're often doing that on an Excel spreadsheet. That'll absolutely work for them. But what we find is that organizations start to grow from being smaller into mid-size and into larger operations. That complexity starts to increase, and the tools that serve them really well at the start aren't going to be able to give them the kinds of operational growth that they're looking for. And that's where the move to a more digital-enabled tool like Replan is going to help them to continue that growth trajectory that they're looking for. So we've been working on it now for probably the last 4 years, although Replan as a company has been around a little bit longer than that. And we've always been focused on using cutting-edge technologies to solve complex problems. And in this case, we're using a set of AI-enabled tools that we wrap a very modern UI around to make it very easy to use. And what we had seen at the time was that there were a lot of very complex tools out there that were designed by PhDs and probably needed PhDs to run them. We recognize that that's not supply chain planners, supply chain directors, people in that operational space want tools that are much more accessible, and that's what we set out to do.
Brilliant. You mentioned one of the challenges there at the start around traditionally demand forecasting, production planning tends to be done on a spreadsheet, or it's in the brain of one, maybe two kind of key individuals within the business. What are the kind of, like taking a step up, what are the kind of global issues you're seeing from a supply chain perspective that are making that process so difficult today that warrants a tool like yours to be deployed?
It's a good question. In the last number of years, I would say probably a little bit pre-COVID, through COVID, and certainly post-COVID, the level of volatility in the market has been significantly increased. That's both on the supply side and the demand side. And what we've certainly saw happen during COVID and post that is that the role of supply chain operations within organizations has been elevated up to the board level. And it's been less of an execution-focused role recently and much more strategic. So the kinds of questions that we're getting asked were much more around, well, where am I vulnerable? And if these different things happen, how can we respond in the best way? So that kind of scenario planning is something that existing tools like Excel maybe struggle to do, because if you've got one or two people doing the facility planning and scheduling, Their day-to-day job is making sure that that plan works and that schedule works. So asking them to do a range of different complex scenarios is taking time away from their day-to-day job. It's quite difficult for them to be able to deliver the answers in a timely fashion. So using kind of digital transformation technologies to enable them to approach that process in a more automated way, where they're elevated out of the day-to-day, and those planners and schedulers are more focused on looking at decision-centric planning or managing by exception, gives them the time back that they can do. The other kinds of pieces that we've seen that have made that more complex have been a changing set of requirements. So, for example, one of the things that was published recently was a AIB produced a PMI, which is a manufacturing index that looks at effectively manufacturing sentiment within Ireland. And it's one of the first times it's been produced for Ireland. And I believe it's an All Ireland report. And the interesting piece there has been changing levels of demand. So orders are dropping off at the moment. We've seen inventory starting to respond to that as well. So inventory levels are dropping in response to those falling orders. So the changing market elements are driving the demand forecasts. You need to keep up with that. So how well can you keep that forecast accuracy as those demand levels are changing from historic norms is a really challenging piece on the demand forecasting side. Then on the supply side, as that demand is starting to drop off, you're looking at how do I best utilize the capacity that I have? If I've outsourced some production, can I start to bring some of that back in? But then how do I maintain the responsiveness that I need to be able to accurately and effectively change that plan if the demand starts to shift back towards increasing demand? So lots of complex questions.
So what I'm hearing is there's a need for kind of complex scenario modeling, there's a need for scenario modeling, but it's made more complex given the number of different inputs into that process and the number of different, scenarios you now need to plan for, whether it's a cost of raw materials shock or a delivery due date shock or just even the availability of raw materials that is ultimately impacting your ability to plan production. But also then there's the changing nature of demand that is impacting how much inventory you want to hold and how much production you want to complete. If you got any use cases or case studies you can share about how using a tool like Replan can benefit manufacturers?
Sure. And I guess this isn't so much a story about Replan as opposed to, and I would say many digital tools that mid-sized manufacturers or large manufacturers might be considering using. And what we find is that there are some challenges, and maybe we'll get into those later on, particularly around whether you have the right data and how difficult it might be to get that data. But there are certainly techniques to try and resolve those issues so they shouldn't stand in the way. But the kinds of results that we would expect to be able to see with a customer using a tool such as ours would be increased throughput. So for any production resource, a line or a work center that they're planning, that we'll see maybe a 3 to 5% increase in throughput. And that's usually by giving them a way to determine better production sequences. So what should I make in what order and how much of it should I make at any one time? And what we find is that when customers are manually planning, you end up with rules of thumb for what products should follow other products. And then you're trying to manage your inventory as a result of that. But getting a tool like ours to be able to take a fresh look at it allows you to better determine the optimum production sequence for any set of macroeconomic conditions and also local conditions within the company. And what I mean by that is that's a combination of your demand, your changing demand forecast. Maybe you're running promotions. You might have a variable amount of warehouse space that you've contracted. You might be looking at both fixed and variable labor components in there as well, and your raw materials, as you mentioned. And by getting a tool or an automated solution to be able to understand that context, usually through a digital twin, which is quite an effective way of trying to model what that looks like. And then you tell it the constraints you're operating within and what does a good result look like, what you're trying to optimize for. That tool is able to give you a better batch size, a better sequence, and free your team up to spend more time thinking about the implications of that result and managing the stakeholders, as opposed to continually running to keep up and trying to get to a plan that will work.
Brilliant. It sounds complex to the uneducated. Is it complex to use and implement, or What do we need to have in place in order to get real value from a tool like Replan?
I would say at the highest level, executive sponsorship is the most important piece. Once you have that direction from the top, that strategy that says that we're going in this direction and we can see the value of that end result, we find that typically everything else falls into place. And that can be hard because there are so many competing priorities around what to spend time, resources, and capital on. And if I think about many of the manufacturers that I'm talking to, they're looking at whatever that spend might be and going, well, that's money I'm potentially taking away from putting another machine on the floor, for example, or maybe I need to expand that factory in the footprint that I'd like to be able to spend it on. And what I would say to that is that an effective planning solution will deliver you more capacity quicker than you'll be able to get by spending money on a machine. You'll be able to use your existing resources that you already have, that you know how they work. You've got your maintenance planned on them. Your team are trained on them. They know the vagaries and intricacies of that machine and will help you, or a tool like ours will help you to get much more value out of that existing capital investment. And then, yes, you may need to add another machine or two on afterwards, but far better to sweat the existing asset as much as possible. So that's the executive strategy, first of all. The next piece is good data is really helpful in accelerating the engagement. So when we work with organizations, if their data is in a reasonably good state, we'd expect to be able to do a pilot with them. Front to back, total time will take about 4 weeks. So these really aren't very extended pilots where it's 6 or 12 months. We'll maybe spend 2 or 3 weeks in advance of the pilot to spend a little bit of time with somebody who knows their data to get it lined up and ready to transfer to us. And then it's 4 weeks and we'll get a plan out at the very latest inside the first week. And that's typical of a lot of the modern digital technologies. I think it's very reasonable for anybody who's listening to think that if I'm investing time in a pilot, that I want to be able to see a result very early on in the process. And I think that's a really important step because it allows you to sense check that you're going in the right direction and that whatever piece of technology isn't going in the wrong direction for weeks or months before you can start to course correct. So the earlier you can do that, the better. And that's one of the reasons why we structure our pilots in that way, where it's very frequent touch points, and then we're showing and checking that results to make sure that it's going in the right direction. The last piece then is that people on the ground, I would say the skills that they have sometimes are really well aligned to moving towards using more modern pieces of technology. And then sometimes there's a little bit more of a learning gap that's there. And again, that comes down to the execs in the business, I would say, where if you're looking at hiring externally or promoting internally, it's really being clear on that overall strategy that you plan to put in place over the next 3 to 5 years. And then making sure that as part of your talent and hiring program, that you're ensuring that you're supporting the development of those skills within the business so that you're ready.
There's so much to unpack there. You guys are a software as a subscription platform, are you?
Yeah.
Your SaaS platform, yeah, incredible. I mean, the first thing that I kind of want to recap there on is the role of the senior sponsor or the role of the executive leader within the organization being a fundamentally important to any sort of digital transformation. I think as well, when we talk about digital transformation, the tech industry is great at adding new terms and bamboozling folk, but digital transformation doesn't have to mean like this big, massive change. It can be something as strategic and tactical as deploying a new planning solution and delivering a measurable benefit within your organization. You said there 3 to 5% in additional throughput, but also mitigating the capital expenditure of having to put in a new set of machinery or a new line to get that same increase in throughput. And so many times we see it, manufacturers are spending significantly more on the factory floor than they are in the back office in terms of enabling planning, scheduling, even just the throughput of orders within the office to make best use of their existing capital investment. So having an executive leader that has that foresight and commitment to make the right changes in the right place in order to sweat the assets is massive.
The other piece I'd add there, Mark, is that the change is happening, and certainly we see more and more small, medium, and large companies investing quite strongly in these technologies and putting in a very robust digital transformation strategy. So sometimes it's less about what are we doing within our own organization, and manufacturers can be asking, well, what are my competitors doing? And therefore, what do I need to do to keep up to maintain a competitive advantage? Because if I stick with the area that we work in, if you have one company that's manually planning and you have another company that is doing that planning in an automated way, we find that the company that's doing that planning in an automated way will spend more time doing things like strategic planning. They will be more responsive to changes in the market. And when they do have to respond, they'll be able to respond in a more profitable manner. So I think that change, that shift is happening. That's not just in planning. We would see a lot of work being done, let's say, on the factory floor and things like line condition monitoring. How do I drive better OEE on the line itself? We see it a lot in the demand forecasting side. How do we use tools to be able to better forecast what the demand for specific SKUs is going to be and what that variability looks like in the demand for each one of those. And that's just on the kind of supply planning side of things before you move outside of that into the back office operations you were talking about.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I was asking whether Replan is a SaaS tool. I knew it was, but I just wanted to double check, because one of the things that is fundamental to the strategies that Rubik puts together for our customers is this concept of making best use of SaaS technology to quickly deploy and deliver value to your business. And it doesn't have to come at, replacing your existing ERP or whatever your investment is there to date. You can complement or even augment your existing capability with these great SaaS tools that are relatively easy to deploy and deliver value quickly, provided you have your data in the right shape. So talk to me just a little bit about what should businesses be thinking about in terms of getting high quality data or maintaining the right level of data to make use of a tool like Replan. What are the things that you commonly find or pitfalls today?
So for all of the organizations that we work with, they will have planning data that they're using already. It's probably sitting in an Excel spreadsheet, maybe it's in their ERP, or they might have some version of a planning solution that's there. When we start to work with any company, one of the first questions that we'll ask them is, okay, we will talk about the high level categories of data that they have. And then typical questions would be, when did you last look at that? When did somebody go in and validate, is that accurate or not? And a good example would be run rates. So how quickly am I making that particular product on that machine or on that line? Because what can happen is that the planning data might have been updated a couple of years ago. Your maintenance or your technical team might have made some upgrades on the line. Maybe you're able to run that product a little bit faster on the machine. Or maybe for whatever reason, the ops team don't actually run that product that quickly and you've got to dial that rate down. So we would often see a disconnect between the planning data and what's happening on the ground. And there are some easy enough metrics to look at that. So things like your plan accuracy, your plan stability, is how well aligned is the plan to what's actually being made on the factory floor. That's a good indication of the health of your data when we think about planning and scheduling, at least. But at its highest level, the first question I'd ask is, who owns the data? When was the last time somebody checked whether that data was right or not? And that can be as simple as just a quick spot check, take a couple of values, go down to the factory floor, actually check, are they right or not? If they're right, great, you're in really good shape. If they're not, we've often seen people get maybe an intern or someone to support them to look at updating that as a project over the summer. Great project to get that intern really involved in the operational aspects of the data. But you also don't have to wait for that. I would take it in bite-sized chunks. We find certainly when we look at planning and scheduling, each different component of master data tends to be quite discrete, and it's something you can tackle week on week, month on month to build a better and more accurate picture. And you can do that in quite a manual way by just interfacing better with the operations teams. There are also a range of tools that we can plug into that will pull the data out in a much more automated way. So we work with things like line condition monitoring solutions that actually sit on the machines on the factory floor. They pull the data in a very Industry 4.0 way. They'll read the data in, they'll be looking at it and reporting more for the operational teams to look at how well the lines are performing. But the planning team can pull that data in and use that to update their planning assumptions or their planning master data, which they can then use to drive better plans that are more accurate and more achievable. So when they create the plans and the schedules out of that data, when it goes onto the factory floor, they should be much more representative of what that production team will actually be able to produce. So you get a much better meshing between the planning and operations teams. Often that can be a challenged relationship, but we find that having good data that at least agrees on both sides is a good step to improving that.
Absolutely. And like, we're not even talking about big data, are we? Like you talked about mastering data, it's reference data, it's stuff that is manageable, that gives context about your operating environment, so your products, the makeup of your products, the throughput of your machine, the failure rate of your machines. So I suppose in a lot of ways, there really is no excuse for not maintaining a high level of quality of this data if you can use it to drive such business benefit. It's something that you should really give focus to and not just leave it laying by the wayside or continue to do things manually the way you've always done them. You know, the opportunity is here. And you mentioned at the start, if you're not doing it, or if you're listening to this podcast today and you're maybe doing production planning the way it's always been done on a spreadsheet, your competitors are definitely moving in the right direction. They are moving to tools like Replan and whatever else might be out there from an automated planning perspective. And these are going to leverage AI. You're leveraging AI today, aren't you, in some respects?
We are indeed, yeah. So there's a couple of maybe pieces to go through there. When we think about the master, the data challenge there, whether you're planning on continuing to plan in a manual fashion or you're looking to move to a tool, you should try and check that your data is accurate and is current, because no matter what way you're going to produce better plans if your data is more representative of what's happening at the factory floor. And I think doing that exercise allows you to drive some really interesting and very valuable conversations. When you start to see a difference between what your planning team think is happening on the ground and what your operations team are actually doing, there will always be differences. And when you start to reconcile those differences, I think you'll start to have some very interesting and challenging conversations about why those changes have happened and where the drift is. In terms of Replan, absolutely. So we take that master data, we build a digital twin to understand how each product is made. And then we use AI to help the planners to find that optimized production plan. For our customers, they tend to work in relatively complex production environments, and they deal with a lot of data. There's a lot of the demand, for example, could stretch out to 12, 16, maybe even 52 weeks. So AI is a great tool to enable us to be able to balance a large number of constraints against lots of demand data and help the planner to find the right answer. So what does that solution space look like? If I think about one of our simpler customers, the total number of potential different plans is 10 to the power of 78. So it's 10 followed by 78 zeros. So it's an enormous space for anyone to try and operate in, to try and find the right plan, what an optimized plan is. That's where a tool like AI is fantastic to help you to automate that process of searching. And what we find is that when you're doing it manually, as I mentioned, you'll naturally have a set of heuristics or rules of thumb that you use to help you to try and navigate that to get to a good plan. But using the likes of an AI solution will help you to get to a better plan. And that's what we help customers to do.
Yeah, I think given the direction of travel, it's only going to become more integrated. I mean, the plan is going to connect directly to the machines, and the machines are going to run themselves. And the way IoT 4.0 or Industry 4.0, whatever it is moving, your factory will almost become black box from the office to the factory floor. What other objections or obstacles do you find that people raise when you talk to them about deploying Replan? Because it seems like a no-brainer to me. It seems if I were able to deploy it in 4 weeks, if I had decent quality data, if I had an enthused partner like yourself, getting 3 to 5% throughput, like why wouldn't I deploy it? What are some of the other obstacles people raise?
I would say with most, if not all of the manufacturers that we work with, there's always a range of different things that they could be spending their time and attention on. So it's really, where do the executives of the business want to spend that attention of their teams and what's most important for them? Sometimes that's managing their inventory levels because they've got a real challenge around hitting some target stock. It could be around getting a better maintenance profile in on the machines because they need to make sure that they've got an issue with uptime on the machines. And they look at it and go, we're going to solve that problem first, and then we'll come back and we'll try and figure out the planning piece. But just to go back to a comment you made around kind of black box planning and running a factory almost lights out, I think honestly we're an awful long way away from that. Anytime we see planners using planning, they add an immense amount of value into what we're doing, into the output of our solution. So really what we would see is that Replan gives them a better way to get to a great plan and schedule very quickly. But the planners then bring their own knowledge and experience of how the factory works and how their customers are operating and the context that sometimes doesn't exist within the data to ensure that the plans are realistic, they're achievable, and they're hitting their customer metrics as well. So we see them as being a core stakeholder in taking a plan, looking at it, tweaking it, managing the stakeholders, whether that's on the procurement side, looking at your raw materials, be on the labor side, it could be the maintenance team, it can be the operations team. Well, they act as that core interface to ensure that the plan can be translated smoothly into something that's executed on the factory floor. I think if we tried to take the planners out of that equation and push plans straight from an AI solution then onto the factory floor, I think we'd really miss a lot of the value that is inherent in that transfer from a plan to a person looking at it, signing off on it, whether that's at a high level up at a sales and operations or S&OP review cycle, maybe that's down at S&OE, which is more of a weekly process, or even down to signing off on daily schedules and making sure that the team that are on the floor understand what's happening and why it's happening as well, which is a really key part of it.
It's really refreshing to hear, Kevin. I mean, some of the time when we talk on this podcast, we almost drift into the topic of conversation around, is AI out to get everyone's job? And I think to your point, we are a long way from that. If anything, all it's delivering now is additional capability for experienced manufacturers to do things faster, more effective, more efficiently, like any tool. It could be any tool within the organization. And to think of it as just that, a tool, an extension of the operator, as opposed to replacing those deep skill sets that are there today.
That's exactly it. It's really equipping, in our case, the planners and schedulers with a tool that helps them to elevate what they're doing. So we use terms like decision-centric planning or planning by exception. Well, what does that mean? It means that the planners are spending less time manually updating the plans. That means that every day they're coming in to a slightly tweaked forecast, a different set of orders, and they have to rebuild that plan every day or at least every week to try and keep up. That is value-add activity because it needs to happen. And if it doesn't happen, your procurement and your service and delivery are going to get out of sync. But that's something that we can automate very effectively and give you a better result. And what that means is that the planners and schedulers are coming in the morning to a ready work plan, and they're looking at that going, now what? What am I going to do with this information to make sure that we can execute on this? Maybe that's I've got to phone up a supplier to see if we can expedite a delivery. Maybe it's that I need to add an extra shift this weekend to make sure that we can hit our service targets. Or I might look at flexing my warehouse space because I can see how my inventory profile is starting to change over the next 12 weeks. That's a much more value add set of activities than spending the first 2, 3, or 4 hours of every day in Excel trying to update a set of plans to see what decisions do I now need to make, and you're not getting to those until well after lunch. And then you've got to have a couple of meetings, and before you know it, the day is gone and you're back at the start of that cycle the next day.
You know your customer very well, Kevin. You're replaying conversations that we have out in the field time and time again, but that fear of going in, having your first cup of coffee or your first cup of tea and opening up the spreadsheet and trying to pull the data back in from the ERP and run your plan again, and only to then have to update it at some point throughout the day. So just in summary then, so what would be your advice to manufacturing leaders that are listening to this podcast who are maybe interested in getting the types of benefits a Replan could deliver, but are struggling with priorities? How should they go about thinking about trying to get this type of capability in their organization?
I should do a shameless plug for Replan.tech. First of all, you can feel free to go on the website and you can reach out and one of the team will be happy to have a conversation with you. And the reason I say that is that every manufacturer's context is different. And we spend a lot of time early on in our conversations understanding not just the planning and scheduling challenges that they might have, but how that fits within overall set of priorities that the business has. And then understanding whether there's some opportunity to leverage benefits in the planning side, for example, with how they can create opportunity for a more effective maintenance schedule on their machines and therefore reduce their unplanned downtime, for example. But for me, as a manufacturing exec listening, I'm going to think about, well, what are my strategic objectives for 2024? I mean, we're almost halfway through the year at this stage. And how well am I tracking towards those? And then what building blocks do I need to put in place this year so that I can deliver on my 2025 objectives? Because these kinds of solutions, and yes, we can run a pilot in 4 weeks, but it's never that quick and easy. There's always a little bit of a run into it. So you've got to make sure that your team is ready, that you've got the data there, that your team are excited about the potential of the pilot and where that's going to lead. So it always takes a little bit more time than you would expect. So for me, when I'm talking to execs, it's understanding the steps that they can take today and tomorrow. That's setting them up for success, particularly around planning and scheduling for the future. Now, when I think about planning, for us, we would talk about it as being the engine, or supply chain being the engine of the total organization. So if you can get a great supply plan running, that's going to help to ensure that engine is running smoothly, because everyone can see the impact of the demand, or the changing demands, the changing supply capabilities, changes in raw material availability on those overall operational KPIs, like your OEE, your overall equipment effectiveness, or your service rates, or your inventory targets. So that supply plan is that core translation of everything, all that hard work that your commercial team are doing, and all the hard work that the operations are doing in trying to actually get that product out the door. A supply plan is a core translation between those two bits of the business. So getting that working as effectively as you can will help you to tune up the entire organization and ensure that when you come towards the back end of 2024, that engine is singing properly.
Brilliant. Well, Kevin, thanks very much for coming on the show today. As I said at the head of the conversation, Replan is one of those tools that I wish I had built. I have seen it in operation. I've seen a couple of demos, and I think it is a hugely valuable tool that any manufacturer should consider at least taking a look at to see how it's being done by some of the more advanced organizations. And particularly wanted to touch upon this call today about dispelling the myth around these type of tools. To get them deployed takes months or years. It's no longer that long. Technology has changed. Partners have become more advanced. You can deliver value relatively quickly within your organization by using a SaaS tool like Replan. And I think as well, to your point though, it's not just about the technology. There's a huge people element to this, and you've got to bring the people on, because the tool is only as useful as the person who's driving it. Am I right?
Absolutely, yeah. And if we're working with teams that are engaged and excited, they come out of the pilot more engaged, more excited, more positive about the potential. And the people that we work with, they want to create great plans that are really effective, that help the organization to get where it's trying to go to. So we find that they come out of the pilot, will have resolved the planning data challenges that might be there. We'll have talked about their people and process parts of it and what needs to change. And they come out quite fired up and ready to go and looking forward to the next step of that implementation. And that sense of excitement, that's set at an executive level. So for me, it does start at the top and it'll move down. And if you get that clear direction from the executive team, we find that things can move very, very quickly once that's set.
Brilliant. Kevin, thanks again. All the best.
Pleasure, Mark. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning into The Digital Manufacturer. We hope that today's conversation has provided some food for thought or sparked new ideas that will help you on your digital journey. To learn more about any of these topics discussed in the episode, head over to our website, www.rubiktech.co. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform to help others join in the digital manufacturing movement. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a future episode. The Digital Manufacturer is brought to you by Rubik, where we're not just talking about the future, we're making it happen. On behalf of everyone at Rubik, thank you for listening.